Hong Ahung Benzaguru Pema Siddhi Hong Ahung Benzaguru Pema Siddhi Hong Ahung Benzaguru Pema Siddhi Hong Sarva Dharma Dhatu Hello everyone, welcome to the my Sunday Dharma talk. I'll just put, for anyone who's new, there's my information in the nearby chat. If you're interested in getting basic information about me. Today we're discussing the Mahaparinibbana Sutta. And I'll just go right into it. 47 pages in length in Walsh's translation. The Mahaparinibbana Sutta is probably the largest sutta in the Sutta Pitaka. Walsh calls this sutta the Great Passing. In a biographical context, it refers to the passing over or death of the Buddha. However, the translation I have given it highlights its doctrinal significance. Para refers to going beyond, much as in English, whereas a more modern translation of nibbana than extinction, or even annihilation, which was popular at the turn of the last century, is emancipation. A translation I've seen actually used, and I like it, so I picked it up. And since technically nibbana is the extinction of illusion, or even more technically, desirous attachment to illusion, I think the negativity of the translation extinction or annihilation is misleading, since it is really from the perspective of samsara. Its nirvana is less of a extinction or annihilation than a awakening or to reality or a realization of the nature of reality. This title could also be interpreted as referring to a realization beyond nibbana itself. This sutta gives a meticulous account of the last year, more or less, of the Buddha's life. Two things about this sutta that are of special interest: the biographical details of the Buddha's life, of which this is the longest and most coherent account in the Pali Canon, and the doctrinal details to which the sutta refers, implicitly or explicitly. I have identified 37 of these, ranging from the statement that Tathagatas never lie to the circumstances of the first Buddhist council held about 3 months after the Buddha's death. So what we're going to do in this talk, therefore, is to divide the talk into two parts. First, we're going to focus on the biographical dimension of the sutta and summarize the events described in the Mahaparinibbana Sutta to provide context for the discussion that will follow, and this introductory portion will take about half an hour. In the second part, we will identify and discuss the 37 principles one by one in the order in which they appear and in some detail. In order to process this amount of information, we're going to limit the discussion for this talk to the end of each part and try to finish within a 2-hour window. And if there's any subsequent discussion people want to have in Zhuangzhong after the presentation is finished, then we can gather there and have an open discussion if people are interested in doing that. Since this is such a deep, long, and rich sutta. The sutta opens with the Buddha staying at Vulture's Peak, near Rajagaha. We encountered Rajagaha, which is same as modern Rajgir, the first capital of the kingdom of Magadha, a kingdom that included republican communities, in the second sutta, in which the Buddha is asked to explain the fruits of the homeless life. Vulture's Peak, Gijakuta, literally the hill of vultures, Walsh describes as a, quote, a pleasant elevation above the stifling heat of Rajagaha, unquote. It becomes famous later as well in the Mahayana Sutras. The king of Magadha at that time was Ajatasattu, famous for murdering his father, Bimbisara, and expanding the Magadha kingdom by conquest and expansion, so that it became the most powerful kingdom in northern India. At this time, Ajatasattu wanted to attack the Vajjayans. Ajatasattu respected the Buddha, so he sent his minister, Vasakara, to use the Buddha as a kind of oracle, since, like Vulcans in the Star Trek universe, Buddhas never lie. Note the word never, not cannot. That is to say, a Buddha exists in a state of perfect self-synchrony, in which emancipation and the power of truth are related. We have discussed the power of truth in previous talks, so I'm not going to go into that further here. Before, we have seen also how the Dharma relates emancipation and psychic powers, possibly the first in India to do so, if we can trust a statement in the Wikipedia. The Buddha, speaking to Ananda, presents a list of 7 principles for preventing decline based on the law of karma. Since the Vajrayans follow them, their society is healthy, strong, and able to repel any attack. Vasakara decides that to conquer the Vajrayans by force is impossible, that is to say, after discussing it with the Buddha, but that a war of propaganda might set them against each other. And I believe, in fact, the Magadhans did, in fact, conquer the Vajrayans. Because of this conversation, the Buddha teaches the 7 things that are conducive to welfare to the Sangha. The Buddha also gives a comprehensive discourse at Vulture's Peak before he moves on to Ambalataka. In each subsequent place, he's going from place to place through this sutta. In each subsequent place, he repeats the same comprehensive discourse on the mutual interdependence of morality or self-control, mindfulness or meditation, and wisdom, the so-called threefold classification of the Noble Eightfold Path, which we've also discussed in other talks, previous talks. We've encountered Ambalataka before in the first sutta, where Sapiya and Brahmadatta are debating the merit of the Buddha within earshot of the Sangha while they were traveling together. Afterward, he travels on to Nalanda, the future site of the famous Nalanda University, but a minor village at the Buddha's time. Here, Sariputta, the disciple renowned for his wisdom, declares that there will never be anyone greater or more enlightened than Gautama. Rather than accept such lavish praise, the Buddha questions Sariputta, asking him how he could know that this statement is true. Quoting, "You have spoken boldly with a bull's voice, Sariputta. You have roared the lion's roar of certainty. How is this? Have all the Arahant Buddhas of the past appeared to you, and were the minds of all those lords open to you, so as to say, quote within quote, these lords were of such virtue, such is his teaching, such his wisdom, such his way, such his liberation," unquote. "And have you perceived all the Arahant Buddhas who will appear in the future? So, Sariputta, you do not have knowledge of the minds of the Buddhas of the past, the future, or the present. Thus, Sariputta, have you not spoken boldly with a bull's voice and roared the lion's roar of certainty with your declaration?" Unquote. The Buddha's segue from praise to irony and his love of the minutiae of language is a characteristic idiosyncrasy of the Buddha Vachana, the Buddha speech, throughout the Pali Canon. I like to think that it reflects a similar quirk in the syntax of the historical Buddha. Sariputta, however, does not accept the Buddha's criticism, saying, quote, "Lord, the minds of the Arahant Buddhas of the past, future, and present are not open to me, but I know the drift of the Dhamma," unquote. And the word for drift of the Dhamma there is Dhammanavaya. Walsh translates vaya as way or drift. The root meaning appears to be energy, strength, vitality, from the Sanskrit vayas. Also man, hero. Sariputta seems to mean that he can identify a true Buddha by his behavior. The conversation ends here. Perhaps the Buddha accepted Sariputta's explanation, since he he himself makes similar statements in another sutta, not concerning himself, but concerning a follower of the Dhamma, or perhaps the conclusion of the discussion has been lost. The Buddha then goes to Patalagama. This is a small water fort where the Ganges, Gandhika, and Son rivers converge. It was a center of trade and commerce that attracted merchants and intellectuals. The Buddha prophesied that Patalagama will become the chief city and be called Patalaputta, which is equivalent to modern-day Patna. This is one of the oldest continuously inhabited places in the world. It is also, according to the Sutta, the home of thousands of spiritual beings, earthbound sky devas, literally shining ones, who were interestingly influencing the minds of the government officials telepathically. It's there. Read it, look it up if you don't believe me, but it's there. This fascinating and easily overlooked detail correlates precisely with Jacques Vallée's study of the repeated appearance throughout history of what are today termed UFOs, which he considers to be both real and physical, but non-extraterrestrial. And we'll be discussing Buddhism and the phenomenology of the UFO in a later talk. But for the moment, I would recommend, if you're interested in this, looking at this correspondence further, you can look at Vallée's book called Dimensions, which is available in ebook format. It's only available in ebook format now, as far as I know. And of course, most scholars ignore it. The Buddha and Ananda go to Kotagama. Here the Buddha gives a talk on the Four Noble Truths. Then they go to Nadaka, where the Buddha is asked to describe the future rebirths of 12 deceased monastics and lay followers, both male and female, in terms of the grades of the path that leads to arhatship. The Buddha doesn't like doing this, however. It seems that he feels somewhat overwhelmed by the multiplicity of requests, and he indicates that he is tired. So he teaches Ananda a special meditation called the Mirror of Dharma, by which one may attain the grade of a stream winner, or more literally a stream entrant, at will. Perhaps the Buddha's fatigue is the first indication that something might be wrong with him. Next, the Buddha travels to Vesali, the capital city of the Lichawi, the dominant tribe of the Vajjian Confederation. I do see a question. We're going to save our questions till the end of the first part. I'll go back through the chat. If there are questions there, we can discuss them at that point. So the Vesali is the capital city of the Lichawi, the dominant tribe of the Vajjian Confederation, and the birthplace of Mahavira, the great Jain reformer who lived at the same time as the Buddha. The city is described as large, crowded, rich, and prosperous, with abundant food and numerous pleasure gardens and lotus ponds. This is the residence of the royal courtesan, Amrapali, who entertains the Buddha and his entourage. Here he gives a talk on mindfulness and meditation. Next, they visit Belua, described as a little village just outside Vesali. Here the Buddha stops for the rainy season, sending the rest of the monastics back to Vesali. If you look closely at the text, you'll see that's precisely how it's positioned. The Buddha wishes to spend the rainy season, which was July to October, alone. It seems that the decision to stay in Belua is something of a surprise, since it is clear from the Sutta that the Buddha actually sent the monastics back to Vesali, rather than simply leaving them behind, which you'd think would be the more logical choice. Since Belua is just outside of Vesali, it's very close. Ananda, however, stays with the Buddha. Shortly, mortal pains afflict the Buddha. By an effort of will, the Buddha overcomes these feelings and for a time seems to have recovered. Ananda comes to him and entreats the Buddha to give a final statement about the order to the Sangha before he dies. Ananda's request and the Buddha's reply suggests that there were some successional issues already developing within the order that Ananda suspected might develop into a crisis after the Buddha's death. The Buddha seems cross, quoting, "But Ananda, what does the order of monks expect of me? I have taught the Dhamma, Ananda, making no inner and outer. The Tathagata has no teacher's fist in respect of doctrines. If there is anyone who thinks I shall take charge of the order, or the order should refer to me, let him make some statement about the order. But the Tathagata does not think in such terms. So why should the Tathagata make a statement about the order? Ananda, I am now old, worn out, venerable, one who has traversed life's path. I have reached the term of life, which is 80. Just as an old cart is made to go by being held together with straps, so the Tathagata's body is kept going by being strapped up. It is only when the Tathagata withdraws his attention from outward signs, and by the cessation of certain feelings, enter into the timeless concentration of mind, that his body knows comfort. Therefore, Ananda, you should live as islands unto yourselves, being your own refuge, with no one else as your refuge, with the Dhamma as an island, with the Dhamma as your refuge, with no other refuge." Unquote. The Buddha takes Ananda to the Chapala shrine in Vesali, where he prepares Ananda for his imminent death 3 months hence. Afterwards, they travel to the gabled hall in the great forest, where the Buddha calls together an assembly of the monastics, and, in fact, he does deliver a final statement to the Sangha. After the rainy season ends, perhaps in October, Ananda and the Buddha travel to Bandagama, where he speaks on samsara and non-rebirth. The Buddha and Ananda then travel to a succession of places, including Hatagama, Ambagama, Jambugama, yes, that's right, Jambugama, and Bhoganagara, in the last of which he teaches the 4 criteria. After this, the Buddha and Ananda go to Pawa, now, surprisingly, named Fazilnagar, if that's how it's pronounced. I don't think that's a Pali word. It sounds Islamic, actually. But in any case, the current name for the place that in the Buddha's time was called Pawa is now Fazilnagar, Fazilnagar, located in the Republic of Mala, north of Magadha. The Malas are described as a brave and warlike people. Here the Buddha stays at the mango grove of Chunda the blacksmith. Chunda comes to receive teachings from the Buddha and invites him to take his morning meal with him, which he does. This meal famously, or notoriously, includes a dish called Pig's Delight. The Pali is Sukara Madhawa. The dish does not agree with the Buddha, who experiences bloody diarrhea and mortal pains. The Buddha declares his intention to travel to Kusinara, or Kushinagar, now Kushinagar, a celebrated center of the Mala kingdom. On the road, the Buddha is overcome by fatigue and rests under a tree. Overcome by thirst, he asks Ananda to bring him some water from the nearby stream. Ananda tells him that it was recently disturbed by a large number of wagons or carts, and urges the Buddha to wait till they reach the river Kakuta. However, the Buddha cannot wait, and insists that Ananda bring him the tainted water from the stream, potentially poisoning him with a toxic infection as well. The Sutta naively informs us that the water became pure as Ananda approached it. After refreshing himself, the Buddha and Ananda go on to the river Kakuta, where the Buddha enters the river, bathes, drinks, and goes to the mango grove. There he lies down on his right side. Again, the Buddha moves on, this time to the Mala's sal grove, that is a grove of sal trees, near Kushinara, across the Hiranawati River. on the bank of which he lies down on his right side, his head pointing north. This is a sacred yoga posture in which righteous Hindus still prefer to lie if they can arrange it. The traditionalist Kumaraswamy, famous Indian-American author and traditionalist, I believe he prepared his death in just that way. The sal trees, or Shorea robusta, which is the Latin name of that species of tree, are barren. The Sutta naively states that they burst forth into blossom. Since the sal tree blossoms naturally in April to June, the sal tree festival is held in June. It seems likely that this occurred in the late winter, perhaps March, about the time of the Buddha's 80th birthday. It also makes sense that the Buddha would living outdoors as he was much of the time. This would be the time when his aged body would be most vulnerable to the environment. So it makes perfect sense that it would be late winter. The Buddha gives final instructions concerning his funeral, the disposition of his remains, and other things to Ananda, and he praises him to the monastics. As Ananda summons the Mallas to witness the death of the Buddha gives a Dharma talk to Subhadra, and actually ordains him, which at that time was simply a verbal formula, of course. The Buddha then gives his final instructions to the Sangha. His last words were, quote, "Now, monks, I declare to you, all conditioned things are of a nature to decay. Strive on untiringly." The Buddha falls into a coma, and in the third watch of the night, about 2 to 6 a.m., he dies. Most scholars today say that this took place between 410 and 370 before the Common Era. And I put a little slide up there. You can see, I'm not going to go into detail about the chronology of the Buddha's death, but you can see there's been an evolution. You just look down the chart from top left to bottom right. You can see there's been an evolution in scholarly opinion, which has been placing the death of the Buddha, Parinirvana, more and more recently. Most scholars now concur with a date of about 400 before the Common Era, plus or minus 20 years or so. The Mallas honor the body of the Buddha with dance, song, music, garlands, and perfume for a whole week. Then they take the body outside the east gate to the Malla's shrine at Makuta Bandhana, possibly a hall. Meanwhile, Mahakassapa has been traveling when he hears of the Buddha's death, and he makes his way to Kusinara, arriving just in time to witness the cremation. The Buddha's body is cremated, and amidst some bickering, the relics are divided into 10 parts, which are distributed to various tribes who are friendly towards the Buddha and his teachings. These sites of great stupas continue to receive veneration and pilgrimage right up to the present time. One of these relic depositories was discovered in the late 19th century by William Pepe and is widely believed to contain at least part of the mortal remains of the Buddha. And in the slide that I'm showing currently, you can see an image of that very urn that was discovered in India or Nepal, I'm not sure which, probably India, I think, in the late 19th century. So that concludes the first part of the talk, in which we have summarized in overview the events of the Mahaparinibbana Sutta. So now we can discuss it if anyone has any questions. And I see that Josbe has a question. In Sutta 16, line 2.7, okay, it said that the Nanda, by the destruction of the 5 lower fetters, has been spontaneously reborn and will gain Nibbana from the state without returning to this world. Okay, I don't recall that specifically, but okay. Question 1 is, what does spontaneously here imply, if accidental or karma-driven, or FI because of revolution? Actually, I do recall the term spontaneously reborn, and it's a conventional term for being reborn as a deva. I believe the idea was that the devas simply appeared in the Deva world, when they came into manifestation in a Deva world, that they were not born of parents. And I believe that is what that implies. Question, hence, as you said, she will never be reborn in this world, right? So therefore, clearly she's been reborn as a Deva. Question 2, was she reborn in a higher realm as this world? I think the teaching is that she should have been reborn in a pure abode since she destroyed the 5 fetters. Yes. If she's become an arhat and has destroyed the fetters almost entirely, she will be reborn in the 5 pure abodes. And yes, then, as I said, she's been reborn in the Deva world, is what spontaneous rebirth means. Question 3, if the answer to the second question is yes, okay, which it is, should one not regard the teaching that it is hard to attain full enlightenment when born in a higher than this world realm as extremely relative? I think what you're referring to are the 5 pure abodes, correct? So you're saying because the teaching that it's hard to be reborn, to achieve enlightenment as a Deva, because it's for the reasons that we all know, I think. Why are arhats reborn in the 5 pure abodes, which are Deva realms? They attain emancipation from a Deva world, and you're absolutely correct. It is relative, and I am not clear on just the degree to which this is true. It is clearly not true of the 5 pure abodes, as you say, and it is also clear that there are Devas who are disciples of the Buddha, and therefore are capable of aspiration, at least, to Buddhahood. So I prefer, based on everything I have read and thought about, I would say it is more difficult for many Devas to aspire and achieve emancipation from a Deva world, but not impossible. And the 5 pure abodes certainly are an exception to that. You're absolutely correct. Any other questions before we proceed on to the second part of the talk, which is going to take us approximately an hour and a half to complete? Any other questions? Let me just take a sip of my juice. Okay, it seems to be no more questions. So let's carry on. Almost 40 fundamental spiritual principles are embedded in the narrative, but they're easily overlooked if one focuses on the biography, which most people do. Thus, the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, the Mahaparinibbana Sutta constitutes one of the most important foundational documents of historical Buddhism. So I have a list of principles, numbered principles. I think what I will do, I'm simply going to discuss each principle in turn. I do have references as well for where they occur in the Sutta. So I'm going to put them one by one in the chat, just read it and discuss it. And this will be available on note cards, so if you're interested in looking back at the exact text that it's based on, you can do that as well. So the first principle, and we've already mentioned this in the biographical overview, is that Tathagatas never lie. Easily conflated with the idea that Tathagatas cannot lie, which may or may not be true, but the actual statement is that Tathagatas never lie. King Ajatasattu of Magadha uses the Buddha as an oracle, in essence, because Tathagatas, having achieved self-perfection, are both internally and externally completely self-consistent, both with themselves and with reality, as they must be if they have reached identity with their ground. This passage highlights the paradox, amongst other things. It highlights the paradox of the coexistence of the corrupt and violent nature of Northeast India in the 5th century before the Common Era, and the deep faith in spirituality. In fact, in today's terms, we would have to describe Magadha as a fascist state. Nonetheless, it's where Buddha spent much of his time teaching. And in fact, the Pali language is considered to be identical or nearly identical with the Magadhan language by the Theravadins. Principle number 2, the political philosophy of the Buddha, social democracy, perhaps anarcho-syndicalism. We'll put that second one in brackets, but something to think about. The Buddha sets out a comprehensive political philosophy, thus showing that even a transcendent being continues to care for the inhabitants of the world of samsara. Indeed, the political organization of society is a recurring theme of the Pali Canon. These principles include government by assembly, peacefulness, traditionalism, respect for seniority, women's rights, public religion, and a national spiritual organization. These precepts follow the organizational principles of the quasi-democratic Vajrayan Republic, which were also similar to the principles of the Shakyan Republic of the Buddha's family. Principle number 3, precepts for the Sangha, communitarianism. The precepts for the monastics also parallel those of the Vajrayans and include government by assembly, peacefulness, self-control, which in this list replaces traditionalism, respect for seniority, dispassion, which in this list replaces women's rights, forest dwelling, replacing public religion, and mindfulness, replacing a national spiritual organization. Principle number 4, communism. The Sangha is to be organized based on a commonality of property, but does not supersede civil society which supports the Sangha, so that the Sangha is a function of civil acceptance and not the reverse. Therefore, the concept of a Buddhist religious government is a contradiction in terms, despite the references to a national spiritual commonality. The Sangha is really, in relation to society, as you can see in the Buddha's model, is really designed to be a sort of conscience of society with no actual power, but either economic or political. Interestingly, the fourth continent of Sumeru, Purva Videha, which we've discussed in other talks where I've discussed the 31 planes of existence. And you may recall, if you attended that talk, that the one world ocean has 4 continents, each with a different species of human being on it, India being Jambudvipa. This is the 4th continent of Sumeru, Purva Videha, which is the home of the longest-lived and most advanced race of the 4 races of human beings, with a longevity of 1,000 years, and interestingly, they are communistic. Presumably, this will be the social system of Shambhala, when, according to the Kala Chakra, it appears in the 25th century of the Common Era. That, of course, is Vajrayana Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism, not Pali Buddhism. That's last reference to Shambhala. Principle number 5, wisdom is the salvific principle. This is something that came up in the last talk, and will come up from time to time. This is a point that I tend to emphasize in my talks. A recurring theme that runs throughout the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, almost like a refrain, is the mutual relationship between morality, ethics, virtue or self-control, mindfulness, concentration or meditation, and wisdom or gnosis. This is called the threefold training or the threefold partition, and is not attributed to the Buddha, but to the nun Dhammadina in the Chula Vedala Sutta, who the Buddha declared to be the nun foremost in wisdom. In many sects of religious Buddhism today, this threefold division of the Noble Eightfold Path has virtually superseded the Noble Eightfold Path itself. The path is presented as beginning with the cultivation of virtue, followed by meditation, and because of these two things, wisdom identified with enlightenment arises automatically. The Buddha states that meditation, imbued with morality, brings out great fruit and profit, and that wisdom, imbued with meditation, brings great fruit and profit, referring, of course, to merit. But that it is the mind, imbued with wisdom, that brings about emancipation. Thus, the sequence is morality, since meditation cannot be imbued with something that does not have, meditation, and wisdom, as I've just given it. Note, however, the subtle distinction made here between morality and meditation on the one hand, and wisdom on the other. Morality and meditation are skillful means, upaya, but it is the mind-imbued wisdom that brings about emancipation. From this we conclude that it is wisdom that is the essential salvific principle which brings the threefold partition into alignment with the Noble Eightfold Path, the first limb of which is right view, or wisdom, that leads the aspirant to the attainment of the first crucial stage of the stream entrant. It seems then that the proper sequence of the path is wisdom, morality, meditation. Moreover, wisdom is not merely something that is attained, it is also something that is cultivated. This view is moreover confirmed in the doctrine of dependent co-origination, the Paticca-samuppada, the radical or first principle of which, the root of which, is ignorance or avijja, and that is resolved by wisdom. Wisdom is also the essential attainment of a Buddha, whereas ethics and meditation, leading to the state of dispassion, are the essential attainment of an arhat. If one reads the Pali Canon in its entirety, it is clear that it is the realization of wisdom that brings about emancipation. There are many stories of aspirants attaining emancipation simply by listening to a Dharma talk of the Buddha or another disciple of the Buddha, followed by a period of meditation as short as 5 days. Similarly, the Buddha himself says that emancipation is available after a period of meditation as short as 7 days. Meditation, though essential, is not primary. The sixth principle, Sariputta and the Buddha debate on the greatness of the Buddha, and I alluded to that as well in the opening biographical section. Sariputta, renowned for his wisdom, affirms to the Buddha that the Buddha is the best and most enlightened ascetic, or Brahmin, past, present, or future. Rather than accept this praise, the Buddha turns it against Sariputta, first chidingly affirming him, quote, "You have spoken with a bull's voice, Sariputta. You have roared the lion's roar of certainty," unquote, and then questioning him, quote, "Have all the arhat Buddhas of the past appeared to you, and were the minds of all those lords open to you? Have you perceived all the arhat Buddhas who will appear in the future? Do you even know me as the arhat Buddha?" Unquote. To all these questions, Sariputta is forced to acknowledge that he does not know. Thus, the Buddha ironically concludes, quote, "You have spoken with a bull's voice, Sariputta. You have roared the lion's roar of certainty," unquote. Such is my reading of this text, which might be read by a religious as an affirmation of Sariputta's faith, were it not for the emphasis the Buddha placed on questioning and Sariputta's defensive reply. To me, it sounds ironic. Rather, the Buddha challenges Sariputta to justify his claim. Sariputta's reputation for wisdom was not misplaced, for he turned the tables on the Buddha and proved to the Buddha that his respect for the Buddha was not based on faith or clairvoyance, but on his knowledge of the drift of the Dharma, the Dharmavaya. This recurs to the Buddha's statement that although we may not know the Dharma, we can judge the Dharma by its effect. True Dharma always yields positive karma. Something that has negative karma cannot be true Dharma, reminiscent of the statement by Yeshua, or Jesus, that one can judge a tree by its fruits. One must be careful here, of course, not to conflate real and apparent positiveness. Positiveness does not necessarily feel good, whereas something that does not feel good is not automatically negative. The Buddha has no response to Sariputta's reply, thus perhaps acceding by silence to the wisdom of that reply. Either that, or we could also interpret it as ending with the Buddha's chiding of him and say that the Buddha had the upper hand. So it's really ambiguous exactly what that conversation, what we're supposed to conclude from that conversation. But there is another sutta, as I said, where the Buddha does have this comment on the fruits of Dharma. Principle number 7, comprehensive Dharma versus Dharma in brief. If you read the Pali Canon, comprehensive Dharma is often contrasted with Dharma in brief or in short. The Pali word is sankitena. Sankitena. As Peter Macefield, author of Divine Revelation in the Pali Canon, points out, the distinction is obscure, since the content of comprehensive Dharma and Dharma in brief often appears to be similar. Dharma in brief is frequently requested before an aspirant goes into the forest for a period of intensive solitary meditation, often culminating in arhatship. So it seems to me that it may be similar to an oral transmission or empowerment, as in the tantric traditions. And principle number 8. Whoops, just give me one moment. There we go. Principle number 8, the motif of the axis mundi. The Pali Canon frequently presents the Buddha as sitting with his back against a pole, pillar, or tree. The monks sit behind the Buddha, facing the lay followers who sit in the east, facing the Buddha. Thus, to the Sangha, the Buddha appears in the place of the rising sun, and to the lay followers in the place of the setting sun, foremost of the Sangha, and with the Sangha as support. The motif of the pole or pillar is, of course, an allusion to the tree of awakening, the Bodhi tree, the Ficus religiosa, sitting under which the Buddha attained enlightenment. The Buddha also experienced his first meditative state while sitting as a child under a rose apple tree. And he also died between two sal trees while lying on the ground in accordance with Indian custom. He was also born under a sal tree. Similarly, the Buddha enjoins his disciples to live in the forest as a place of refuge. India has a long history of sacred trees and forests, as well as many other ancient societies. When the Buddha broke his vow of abstinence, when he was on the verge of dying, he was seated under a tree, and Sujata, who offered him a bowl of rice gruel, believed he was the spirit of the tree, to which she had come to make a food offering. The sacred tree is representative of the polar axis, like Mount Sumeru, through which communication with the higher worlds becomes possible. The pillars of Ashoka recur to this symbolism also, all of which represent the axis mundi, the cosmic axis, world pillar, columna Karolui. It's the center of the world, or world tree, the omphalos, or navel of the world, and is a universal motif or archetype of the Philosophia Perennis, with its origins in prehistoric shamanism. And some of you may have attended my talk, in which I discussed whether the Buddha may be described as a shaman or not, called Was the Buddha a Shaman? Principle number 9, the path of the householder, the way of karma. Buddhism is not merely a spirituality of monastics, ascetics, and recluses. In fact, originally the Buddha emphasized the teaching of lay people, and I'm indebted to Hajime Nakamura for that insight. The Buddha had many disciples who were householders, and many of these disciples attained arhatship. Thus, the Buddhist science of spirituality also includes the path of the householder, which is sometimes called the lunar path or the way of the valley. The path of the householder is based primarily, but not exclusively, on the path of karma, that is, removing negative karma through self-purification and acquiring merit through the cultivation of positive karma. Thus, Buddhism is not divorced from practical life and reveals itself to be a pragmatic spiritual philosophy. This is shown by the Buddha's summary of the perils and advantages of good and bad morality, which he designates failure and success in morality. The advantages of success in good morality, that is, good karma, include wealth, reputation, confidence, and assurance, dying unconfused, and please note that one in particular, and rebirth in a higher world. It is clear from this and other passages that although the Sangha was organized in a communitarian and indeed a communistic way, the Buddha realized that the extension of that system of social organization to civil society as a whole was not practical. It does not seem that the Buddha opposed property and wealth in civil society, for example, though it is clear from other passages that he saw wealth as imposing special social obligations on the wealthy, and that he advocated social redistribution of property and wealth for the general good. It is, however, clear that the Buddha saw the development of money and property. He did see it as an historical phenomenon, as socially pernicious factors that lead to criminality, violence, and war. Principle number 10. The cohabitation of devas and people. And I'm a slide off, I think. That actually was Mount Sumeru. Let's leave it there for the moment. Let's see what happens. The cohabitation of devas and people. The word deva is usually translated as God, but this is really a very unsatisfactory translation. The English word means that which is called or invoked, whereas the Sanskrit Pali word means shining, referring to a celestial being of light, rather like Plato's bisexual flying spheres. And we are off. Where is, there it is. Somehow that got out of sequence. Sorry about that. That's the slide. She goes with this. Let's see. According to the Pali-English Dictionary, devas are splendid, mobile, beautiful, good, and luminous, as well as continuous with the life of humanity and all beings. They are beings who occupy higher worlds in a system of vertical extension that defines samsara, but it is clear from this passage that some devas also coexist with humanity. These earthbound devas are described as minor devas. These include ugly dwarfs or kumbhandas, aerial spirits connected with trees and flowers that dwell in the sense of bark, and actually there they are, or something like them. These are called Gandharvas. Great snakes that can take human form and live in streams, oceans, and caves, known as Nagas. Nature fairies associated with woods and mountains, who also appear as ghosts that inhabit wilderness areas and threaten travelers. These are Yakshas. And finally, large humanoid birds known as Garudas. Interestingly, Patna, or Patalagama, is one of the oldest continuously inhabited places on Earth and the largest city in the world between 300 and 195 before the Common Era. About 300 before the Common Era, 100 years after the birth of the Buddha, the death of the Buddha rather, its population was 400,000. As we can see from the text, thousands of devas invisibly inhabited this city, influencing the minds of the inhabitants telepathically. Principle number 11. The divine eye, the Ajna chakra. And I think our slides are a little bit out of order, so I'm just going to have to find each slide that when I have for each section. There it is. The divine eye, or Dipachaku, is referred to frequently throughout the Pali Canon. In the Pali Canon, this is one of the 6 gnosis, the Chalabhinya. In this context, it refers to knowing the karmic destinations of others. However, it has a larger meaning as well. It is enumerated as one of the three wisdoms, the Tewija or Tuwija, along with remembering past lives and the extinction of mental intoxicants. In the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, the Buddha says he obtained the divine eye during the second watch of the night, that is between 10 p.m. and 2 a.m. approximately, of his enlightenment. In the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, it is by means of the divine eye that the Buddha sees devas. The divine eye is also a universal symbolic motif or archetype. In Egyptian mythology, one finds the eye of Horus. It also appears in Freemasonry, where a semicircular glory appears below the eye, which is enclosed in a triangle. In Christianity, it represents the eye of providence, where clouds or sunbursts surround it. The eye of providence also appears on the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen of the French Revolution. In the Indian chakra system, the eye appears as the Ajna chakra, the eye of intuition and intellect, located in the center of the forehead. In Tibetan Buddhism, the third eye is the upper end of the central energy channel that runs up through the spine to the top of the head. This center is also important in Qigong, Sufism, and Kabbalah. In human beings, the divine eye corresponds to the pineal gland in the center of the brain, a vestigial third eye that actually appears in lizards, amphibians, and fish, which for David Icke fans out there could all be conflated with reptiles, as can the Nagas, which are documented in the Pali Canon. Descartes called this organ the seat of the soul. Modern research has discovered that the pineal gland is the source of naturally occurring dimethyltryptamine, or DMT, the most powerful psychedelic known to man, which is also widely found throughout nature. And interestingly, in the context of our discussions concerning the UFO phenomenon, the Nagas, the reptiles, the reptilians, etc., the fairies and sprites, and all of these creatures, figures, whatever you want to call symbols, whatever you want to call them. Interestingly, DMT facilitates vivid otherworldly visions, including encounters with non-human entities of exactly the sort that we have been describing. So, the next principle is principle number 12. The Buddha was not an extreme ascetic. Although it is well known that the Buddha rejected the extreme asceticism of the Proto-Shaivite samanas with whom he associated prior to his enlightenment, traditionally for 6 years, bringing himself, as you may recall, to the edge of death, and there's a picture of him in that state on the slideshow. The Buddha is still regarded as quite ascetic. Most people, when they hear about the Buddha, they think of him as an ascetic, illustrated, for example, by the quite rigid rules of the Vinaya, which, however, turn out to be far less rigid in the Buddha's mind than in the mind of many contemporary religious Buddhists, as we shall see. Nevertheless, it is clear from the Pali Canon that the Buddha's life, while simple, also had its pleasures. There are numerous examples in the Pali Canon in which the Buddha and his entourage are invited to the home of a wealthy local person, usually either political figures or celebrities, to be entertained with a fine meal of choice hard and soft food, which they invariably eat to their satisfaction, quote unquote. Since the Buddha traveled extensively, this must have occurred fairly frequently. The Buddha and his entourage also often occupied fairly comfortable parks, sometimes quite comfortable parks, including parks that were frequented by royalty, including the king himself, in fact, and other places of great natural beauty. Vulture's Peak itself was one of these. These facts stand as useful corrective to the one-sided view that the Buddha was extremely or exclusively ascetic. Principle number 13. A meaningful miracle, more evidence of Proto-Tantra. Although the Pali Canon is largely naturalistic in its descriptions of people and events, which is one of the arguments for its antiquity, and indeed its primacy, it does attest to the reality of psychic powers, and sometimes these appear as full-blown miracles, as in the story of the Buddha and his entourage teleporting themselves from one side of the Ganges River to the other. This is especially ironic in view of the disparagement of miracles by the Buddha in the sutta called About Paticaputta, the Paticaputta Sutta. Similarly, Yeshua, or Jesus, disparages those who seek for a sign, declaring that no sign will be given to them, yet the Gospels and the Church ascribe miracles to him as the proof of his divinity. Something very similar clearly happened to the Buddha as well, although, to the credit of the redactors of the Pali Canon, these events are fairly rare and not strongly emphasized. The Buddha clearly saw that the belief in miracles leads to a superstitious reverence for the person rather than the one true miracle, the miracle of the Dharma itself, which leads to emancipation. Therefore, I believe we can reliably state that the Buddha did not perform miracles for display, and that these stories are later inventions. Nevertheless, the presence of miracles of this type in the Pali Canon is another indication of the early development of proto-tantric literary motifs, even in the first period of pre-sectarian Buddhism, much as Gnosticism appeared early in the development of the Christian tradition. One can, of course, derive valid teachings from such stories, even if they are not literally or historically true. The 14th principle, which didn't appear in chat, there we go. The 14th principle is called the Mirror of Dharma. The Mirror of Dharma presents a method whereby the aspirants can realize for themselves the state of stream entry, whereby they realize the fact that they will achieve emancipation within no more than 7 lives. The method is to cultivate absolute confidence in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. This method must be differentiated from Christian faith, however, which is virtually defined as belief not based on proof, whereas the Buddha states that the quote-unquote unwavering confidence to which he refers is based on, quote, inspection leading onward to be comprehended by the wise, each one for himself, unquote. Therefore, when the Buddhist speaks of faith, he speaks of something quite opposite to what the Christian refers to when he uses that term. Moreover, the morality of such an aspirant must be perfect. By this method, one can know for oneself as a matter of certainty that he or she has achieved stream entry. Principle 15, mindfulness. The Pali word translated as mindfulness is sati. According to the Pali English Dictionary, the etymological meaning of this word is memory, to remember, also recognition, consciousness, intentness of mind, wakefulness of mind, mindfulness, alertness, lucidity of mind, self-possession, conscience, and self-consciousness. The Sanskrit word is smriti, which also refers to the oral recitation tradition of the Vedas. The reference to self-consciousness is somewhat disconcerting given the Buddha's rejection of the Atta or Atman theory, commonly identified with the self. Mindfulness is probably also connected with the recollection of past lives, which is strongly emphasized throughout the Pali Canon. Mindfulness begins with mindfulness of the body and is then extended to feelings, mind, and mind objects. Principle 16. A courtesan entertains the Buddha. As we have seen, although the Buddha clearly lived a very modest and simple life, it was not without its luxuries. And actually, there she is. in the form of the choicest hard and soft food when prominent people in various communities entertained him, and his close circle of monastics. It is also clear that the Buddha interacted with and taught women without distinction, something that we've discussed previously. A striking confirmation of both of these observations is the Buddha's interaction with Ambapali, a wealthy Ganika who lived in the Lichawi city of Vesali, part of the Vajjian Confederacy. Although Walsh renders the Pali word Ganika by courtesan, comparing her to the Japanese tradition of the geisha, the Pali English dictionary simply renders the word as harlot, one who belongs to the crowd, that is, a common woman, or perhaps a promiscuous woman. Nonetheless, Ambapali was a wealthy and beautiful woman who was a Nagavradu, a royal courtesan who is also a prominent citizen of the town. The Buddha stayed in her mango grove, taught her the Dharma, and went to her home for his morning meal, accompanied by his monastics. So much for the Vinaya rule against consorting with women and a prostitute at that. Clearly, the Buddha was neither a fundamentalist, nor was he a judgmental prude. He consorted with women, he taught them the Dharma on an equal basis with men, and he was not above enjoying a fine meal in the company of a beautiful, albeit high-class, prostitute. In this and many other ways, the Buddha appears similar to Yeshua or Jesus, who is also criticized for exactly the same sort of behavior. Ambapali made a gift of her mango grove to the Sangha, which the Buddha accepted. Principle 17. Energy, the force of life, health, and longevity. Here we encounter the first major sign of the Buddha's impending illness, characterized by diarrhea and sharp pains so severe as to suggest dying, about 10 months before his death. The monastics remained at Ambapali's park in Vesali, whereas the Buddha spent his last rainy season, which would be July to September, in Beluwa, a small town outside the southern gate of Vesali. What is most interesting about this passage, however, is the reference to energy and a force of life, by which the Buddha was able to overcome his illness and postpone its effects so that he could take his leave of the order of monastics. The Buddha recommends the cultivation of energy throughout the Pali Canon, but only in a few places is it clear that this energy is an Edi, a psychic power that has intrinsically healing and life-giving effects, comparable in fact to Kundalini, which the Buddha appears to have experienced during his ascetic period. This brings the Buddha's teachings into relation with Kundalini Yoga, the Tibetan concept of Tumo, the Chinese concept of Qi, etc. Principle number 18. Inner and outer Dharma. Here and elsewhere the Buddha indicates that his teaching has no inner and outer, that he has no teacher's fist in respect of doctrines. This is widely interpreted to mean that Buddhism is exoteric and that there is no esoteric Dharma, no secret wisdom such as Vajrayana, Tantra, Theosophy, etc. imply. However, this is not, strictly speaking, what the Buddha says. The Buddha says that he makes no distinction between inner and outer, teaching everything to everyone openly and without secrecy. Walsh himself recognizes this when he states that there is no contradiction here between this passage and the Simsapa Sutta. In the latter, the Buddha distinguishes between knowledge that leads to liberation and other forms of knowledge, quote, fast as the leaves in the Simsapa forest, the Simsapa, unquote. The Simsapa, of course, is a variety of leafy tree. The latter is of the same order as the former and is realized because of realization. Quote, even so, bhikshus, much more is the direct knowledge that I have known, but that has not been taught. Few is that which has been taught, unquote. The distinction that the Buddha is making appears to be between praxis and gnosis, the latter the goal of the former. Thus, the latter does in effect constitute a secret wisdom, an untaught knowledge that is nonetheless the object of realization. What the Buddha is actually saying here is that he openly teaches the entirety of wisdom, but that he emphasizes the praxis first, because it is through the latter that one realizes the former. In the Simsapa Sutta, the praxis referred to is the Four Noble Truths. Clearly, however, the Buddha taught a great deal more than the Four Noble Truths. This is the only interpretation that reconciles and harmonizes all relevant passages and shows the importance of not selecting the passages that one likes, but rather referring to and collating all relevant passages in order to arrive at a synthetic interpretation. Principle 19, the Sangha has no leader. In this very significant passage, the Buddha makes it clear that he does not want to be succeeded as head of the Sangha. In other passages, the Buddha disdains being thought of as a leader, referring to himself rather as a friend among friends. Later in the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, the Buddha states that the monastics should take the Dharma as their leader. Nevertheless, after the Buddha's death, the Sangha appointed Mahakassapa, at his own instigation, as its leader at the first Buddhist council, followed by Ananda. Since the appointment of a leader violates the Buddha's dictum with respect to the organization of the Sangha, one may question the legitimacy of the early Buddhist councils, and in fact, their legitimacy did become an issue when the Mahasanghikas, the majority, and the Staviras, precursors of the Theravada, the minority, split following the Second Buddhist Council over questions concerning the rules of the Vinaya and the infallibility of Arhants. This split became the basis of the division into the Hinayana and the Mahayana. Principle number 20. The Dharma is the only refuge. The monastics are to live freely as individuals, within a cooperative Sangha, with themselves and the Dharma as their only refuge, sometimes translated as retreat. Again, the reliance on the self is paradoxical in light of the anatta doctrine. Some scholars believe that the formula of the triple jewel, that is, taking refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, is a later innovation that arose about the time of Ashoka in the 3rd century before the Common Era, and that the original refuge formula referred to the Dharma only. Clearly, the kind of Sangha described by the Buddha is very different from the hierarchical, authoritarian Sangha that we often see today. Although the Buddha did substitute respect for seniority for egalitarianism after his death, the Sangha is still supposed to emphasize independent self-inquiry and free thought and consensus, failing which majority rule, without excessive attachment to rules, rituals, or beliefs, and without a singular leader. Recently, the Dalai Lama, to his credit, has honored the Buddha's dictum by stepping down as political leader of the Tibetan administration in exile and fostering a democratic constitution. In this regard, the Buddha appears to be exceptionally modern, perhaps even more modern than some of his contemporary religious followers. Principle number 21, the Four Roads to Power. The Four Roads to Power are another example of magical or proto-tantric thinking in the Pali Canon. This practice is not aimed only at awakening or enlightenment, but also the development of psychic powers. In this context, longevity. In Walsh's translation, success in this practice would enable the practitioner to live for 100 years, close to the maximum longevity of a human being. Specifically, had Ananda taken the hint, he might have asked the Buddha to extend his life by this means and live another 20 years. However, Ananda, who is represented in the suttas as a bit of a dullard, did not take the hint. The Four Roads to Power, the Iddhipada, are not explained further in the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, but we know what was involved from the Virada Sutta. In this sutta, the Buddha states that the practice consists of the development of four qualities: will, or chanda, energy, or viriya, intention, or chitta, and investigation, or vimamsa, which are in turn based on the cultivation of concentration, or samadhi, and concentrated mental aspiration, or padana sankara. Next principle, number 22, the Dharma, the power of truth and merit. We see again a reference in the Dharma of wondrous effect, quote unquote, to the universal idea that pervades the Pali Canon, especially the Jatakas, of the power of truth, or the act of truth. This is a pan-Indian idea that we've discussed before, in which the ultimate truth of things itself exercises an influence that is beneficial and powerful. Mahatma Gandhi utilized the power of truth as a political principle, which he called satyagraha. This is also the principle by which merit may be acquired. The study, teaching, or recitation of Dharma is itself held to be intrinsically efficacious and beneficial. Principle number 23, conscious dying. According to this passage, the Buddha did not die as a matter of accident or involuntarily. He deliberately renounced the life principle, mindfully and with full awareness. One might be inclined to regard this as mythologization, but one would be mistaken. This principle of conscious dying is also found amongst the Tibetan lamas, some of whom are reputedly able to will themselves to death intentionally, and this is widely attested. This practice is portrayed in the movie Little Buddha, which was produced in 1993. Towards the end, if you get it and want to watch it, you'll notice that the Lama does engage in precisely this practice. In Tibetan Buddhism, this practice is called Powa. It is the highest of the 6 yogas of Naropa, and Dzogchen meditation is considered the highest and greatest Powa practice. Principle number 24, 2 nirvanas with and without remainder. Those who attended my series of talks on the Pali Canon last year will remember that there is not one but 2 types of nirvana, the final blowing out or extinction of desire attachment, and one with and without remainder. The arhat who attains nirvana ceases to make new karma due to the absence of desires attachment, but existing karma still needs to work itself out. This suggests that karma is not destroyed by nirvana. If all karma were destroyed by nirvana, then one would die immediately. If the destruction of karma were the precondition of attaining nirvana, then the attainment of nirvana would be impossible. The Buddha does appear to teach that the attainment of nirvana destroys much karma, but not all. This point requires further research. This view of nirvana also corresponds to the Buddha's life. After he attained enlightenment, the Buddha remained in an altered state of consciousness for a whole week, after which he returned to normal consciousness. He continued to live, and the evidence of the Pali Canon is that he continued to engage in spiritual retreats, practicing mindfulness of the breath. This behavior makes no sense if the Buddha were already a perfected being, does it? Rather, it implies a being who still needs and benefits from spiritual work. Finally, the Buddha exhausted his remaining karma and renounced the last vestige of attachment to life. He died, attaining the state of perfection called Parinibbana, final emancipation, characterized by absolute transcendence. Principle number 25, 8 liberations, the 8 jhanas. And these are, and actually, I'm just going to put them, I've talked about the jhanas quite a lot in previous talks, so I'm not going to go into them other than simply summarizing their characteristics. So the first jhana consists of rapture and happiness born of seclusion. The second jhana, delight and happiness born of concentration without applied or sustained thought. The third jhana, quiet, subtle, and pervasive happiness, subtle enjoyment of mindful and equanimous mind without rapture. The fourth jhana, stability, stillness, and equanimity without happiness, and that is the jhana that leads to rebirth in the 5 pure abodes, which was asked about earlier. The fifth jhana is infinite space, the realization of infinite space. The sixth jhana is the realization of infinite consciousness, these are also ontological planes or dimensions of being, the 4 highest dimensions of samsara. 7, nothing. And 8, neither perception nor non-perception, opening, as you can see from the construction of the name, opening to the transdual. And finally, the cessation of feeling and perception, and this level is not attested in all sources, but it is mentioned in some. I believe it is mentioned in the Mahaparinibbana Sutta. Principle number 26, the Buddha's enlightenment experience. Here we have a succinct statement of the Buddha's monumental enlightenment experience, the reference to having just attained supreme enlightenment. This appears to be an early statement, there being no reference to the 3 watches of the night, consisting of the recollection of past lives, karma, and dependent co-origination, the Pattaya-samuppada, respectively. At sunrise, he attains full enlightenment, characterized by the encounter with Mara and the cessation of desirous attachment. Here, however, the Buddha simply attains supreme enlightenment in a moment, suggesting the instantaneous theory of liberation. Here we learn the name of the place, Eruvala, located in the state of Bihar, the river, Naranjara, and the tree, the goat herd's banyan tree. Goat herders, having gone to the shade of the banyan tree, would sit there, hence the name. Interestingly, the commentaries claim that this tree was located to the east of the awakening tree, whereas the Sutta seems to suggest that this was the awakening tree. Principle number 27. Sorry, let me just get at it. There we go. Principle number 27, energy, the force of life, health, and longevity. What is most interesting about this passage is the reference to energy and a force of life by which the Buddha was able to overcome his illness and postpone its effects so that he could take his leave of the order of monastics. The Buddha recommends the cultivation of energy throughout the Pali Canon, but only in a few places is it clear that this energy is an edi, a psychic power that has intrinsically healing and life-giving effects, comparable in fact to Kundalini, which the Buddha appears to have experienced during his ascetic period. This brings the Buddha's teachings into relation with Kundalini Yoga, the Tibetan concept of Tumo, the Chinese concept of Tsi, etc., and is indicative of an authentic science of enlightenment. Principle number 28. Oops, I gave you the whole thing. The intercourse of devas and people. This passage is interesting because it implies several things. First, that the Buddha's Dharma is not directed at humans only, but that it is also directed at spiritual beings or devas. And we've already alluded to this principle in principle number 10, so I'm not going to go into it in greater detail than that. The 29th principle, the 4 criteria, which I mentioned in the biographical overview at the beginning, the criteria of authentic Dharma. After the death of the Buddha's sermons were remembered and recited by the Sangha, especially by Ananda, who had been the Buddha's personal attendant for the last 25 years of his life. Since only Buddhist arhants were permitted to participate in the first Buddhist council, We are fortunate that Ananda, rather conveniently it seems, attained arhatship on the night before the council met, since without his participation, many of the Buddha's teachings would have been lost. Therefore, the Sangha would come together to rehearse the teachings of the Buddha based on the memories of the participants. Of course, as the participants died off, the nature of this transmission changed. From being memories of the actual hearers, as it would have been in the beginning, the recollections increasingly focused on questions of doctrine, clarification, and codification. These traditions were handed down in this way for nearly 300 years. With the passage of time, it became increasingly important to verify the validity of these teachings. It is therefore of interest to read in the Mahaparinibbana Sutta the criteria that were applied to verify the validity of the teachings that were passed down. The Sutta identifies 4 primary sources of such teachings that may be considered: the Buddha himself, but also the community of elders and teachers, a group of many elders, and a single elder. The difference between the community of elders and a group of many elders is not clear to me, but the sources of authority are clearly that the Buddha himself and the senior bhikkhus or teras, both as individuals and in cooperation with others. According to the Pali-English dictionary, any bhikkhu of any seniority may be called Tera because of his wisdom, and in fact, the Mahaparinibbana Sutta says that any monk may claim to have heard a teaching from the Lord's own lips, quote-unquote. So much for the admissible sources of teachings. The Buddha then cautions that any such claim is neither to be approved nor disapproved. Rather, quote, his words and expressions should be carefully noted and compared with the suttas and reviewed in the light of the discipline, that is to say, the Vinaya, unquote. If the teaching conforms to the suttas or the discipline, it is to be accepted. If it does not conform, it is to be rejected. Thus, a continuous preservation of established tradition is to be guaranteed. The Buddha does not say who is sanctioned to verify the teachings. However, elsewhere he says that decisions are to be made by a consensus of the Sangha, or failing consensus, by majority rule. An important point to note in this validation procedure is that it is ideological. It is not historical. The primary criterion is not whether the words and circumstances of the teaching are historically accurate or not, but whether they conform to the established truth of the Dharma based on previously accepted teachings. In other words, is there a reasonable continuity of teaching? Receiving a teaching from the Lord's own lips is the first criterion, but not the only one. Thus, the accusation that is frequently made against the Mahayana Sutras that they are false because they are non-historical is proved irrelevant. The truth or falsity of the Mahayana Sutras is to be validated based on the same criteria as the Pali Suttas themselves. That is, do they conform to the established teachings of the Buddha as handed down by tradition? In this context, therefore, do they conform to the Pali Suttas, which are doubtless older than all but the oldest Mahayana Sutras, goes back to the first, both of which go back to the 1st century before the Common Era. In the same way, the conformity of the Pali texts with each other must also be subject to the same scrutiny. And in fact, that's one of the reasons for my study of the Pali Canon and for this series of talks. Principle number 30, the Buddha's last meal, not food poisoning. The Buddha's final meal is translated by Maurice Walsh as pig's delight, thus glossing over the obscurity of the Pali phrase sukara madhawa, which may refer to pork or to a kind of truffle. This story has led to the speculation that the Buddha died of food poisoning. However, Dr. Metanando Bhikkhu, in his article, How the Buddha Died, and I have the link for that article if you're interested in looking at it. It will also be on my blog at 7 o'clock Eastern Time when it automatically publishes. Dr. Metanando suggests that food poisoning is an unlikely explanation of the Buddha's sickness. First, because the Buddha felt the onset of the sickness very quickly, whereas food poisoning takes several hours to incubate. And second, because food poisoning does not cause the bloody diarrhea described in the Sutta. He also rejects chemical poisoning, peptic ulcer, and hemorrhoids. Dr. Metanando's conclusion, based on the medical information provided in the Sutta, is that the Buddha died of mesenteric infarction, a medical condition in which inflammation and injury of the small intestine result from inadequate blood supply, a common disease of the elderly that is lethal after about 10 to 20 hours. Thus, it was not the final meal that killed the Buddha, but old age, although the size of the meal that the Buddha consumed may have been the trigger that brought about the second and final episode of the disease that we know from previous passages had begun to afflict the Buddha some 10 months earlier. The cogency of Dr. Metanando's analysis also gives us confidence, or faith, in the historical accuracy of the Mahaparinibbana Sutta. So there you have an example of faith based on reason. Principle number 31, women. Here is of my talk the status of women in ancient India and the Pali tradition. We'll be aware that there are two distinct attitudes towards women expressed throughout the Pali Canon. One attitude disparages women, grudgingly admits that women are capable of enlightenment, and admits women to the Sangha as second-class citizens, whereas the other makes no distinction of any kind between men and women and admits women to the Sangha apparently on an equal basis to men. As we have seen in our discussion of the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, the Buddha was not above enjoying a fine meal with a courtesan. Here, however, we see another quite incompatible attitude towards women. We should not look at them, we should not speak to them, and if they speak to us, we should be very careful. The Buddha, of course, did speak to Ambapali. He delivered a talk on the Dharma to her, which the text states instructed, inspired, fired, and delighted her. Of course, it is possible that the rest of his monastic entourage remained discreetly silent throughout the meal. Perhaps. On the other hand, perhaps what we are seeing here is two opposed views of women that are mutually incompatible, as Bhikkhu Bodhi has suggested in his introduction to the Anguttara Nikaya. If we accept Bodhi's view, then we must either believe that the Buddha held two incompatible views simultaneously, that he abandoned one in favor of the other at some point in his career, perhaps when Ananda convinced him, and I put the word convince in quotation marks, when Ananda convinced him to allow women to be admitted to the Sangha, a story that many scholars now question, or that one of these views is an imposition by anonymous misogynistic monastic redactors of the Pali Canon, probably Sri Lankan. Hearers of my talk will know that my view, which I consider the common sense one, is the last one, since the first two views imply that the Buddha was unenlightened. Therefore, my conclusion is that the Buddha was not a misogynist, which I'm sure will relieve many of the ladies in the audience. Creates a problem, though, for Theravada Buddhism. The Thais are still clinging to the notion that women should not be ordained, for example. Principle number 32, Ananda. Not a principle, but a point of discussion. It is ironic that Ananda, who is called the guardian of the Dharma due to his photographic memory, was both the Buddha's closest disciple and the least accomplished. In many ways, he is portrayed in the Suttas as being a bit thick. Nevertheless, he served the Buddha faithfully as his personal attendant during the final 25 years of the Buddha's ministry, when the Buddha was 55 to 80 years old, and he became the source of much of the Sutta tradition collected in the Pali Canon. Ananda and the Buddha were first cousins through their father, King Suddhodana. We should really perhaps properly speak of Chief Suddhodana now, as it's no longer believed that he was a king in any monarchical sense. Their father, Chief Suddhodana. The Buddha described him as kind, unselfish, popular, and thoughtful, that is, Ananda, as well as chief in conduct, service, and memory. Nevertheless, Ananda's participation in the first Buddhist council, convened by Mahakassapa, the Buddha's disciple who was foremost in asceticism, was contested because he was only a stream entrant. The Pali Canon portrays Ananda as an imperfect, albeit sympathetic figure, lonely and isolated following the death of the Buddha. Nevertheless, he rather conveniently attains nirvana on the eve prior to the convention of the First Buddhist Council, during which he was severely criticized by the Arhants for persuading the Buddha to ordain women, as well as his failure to ascertain from the Buddha which were the major and which were the minor rules of the Vinaya. Principle number 33. The gradual versus the instantaneous path. The reference to 4 grades of attainment recalls the discussion that one finds in various places between advocates of the view of the gradual path and advocates of the view of the non-gradual path. That is enlightenment a process of gradual development, or is enlightenment attained instantaneously? The 4 grades are, of course, the attainments of stream winner, or stream entrant, once returner, non-returner, and arhat. This is an interesting problem. There are various allusions that bear the topic that I hope to bring together into a coherent discussion in the future, which I'm not prepared to discuss further today. It is, however, interesting that this path, the path of the arhat, which the Buddha doubtless taught, is not the path of the bodhisattva, literally a wisdom being, which the Buddha himself followed, and the Pali Canon does make it clear that the 10 powers of an arhat are not the same as, and apparently inferior to, the 10 powers of a Buddha. An essential difference, moreover, is that a bodhisattva/Buddha is self-ordained by definition, as in the original Samana tradition, which reappears later in the Brahmanet and Srimala Sutras, whereas an arhat always receives the Dharma from a Buddha. The Buddha himself is also referred to as an arhat, but an arhat is never referred to as a Buddha. The distinction between an arhat and a Buddha became a point of contention following the Second Buddhist Council, which resulted in the Great Schism between the Mahasanghika majority, which subsequently developed into the Mahayana, and the Sthaviravada minority, which subsequently developed into the Hinayana, including the Theravada. Principle number 34. The Dharma retreat. The imminent death of the Buddha obviously raised the problem of how the Sangha should be organized after the Buddha's death. In these passages, the Buddha addresses this issue. First and foremost, the Buddha states that the Dharma and the discipline, the Dharma Vinaya, which is the name the Buddha always gave to his teaching, is to be the teacher after his death. In addition, whereas during the Buddha's lifetime the Sangha was egalitarian, in which all members of the community addressed each other, even the Buddha, as friend, awuso, rather like the Quakers, after his death the Buddha declared the Sangha should be organized as a decentralized hierarchy based on seniority, in which the junior monastics would address the senior monastics as Lord, Bhante, or Venerable Sir, Ayasma. Some scholars also hold that the formula of the triple jewel, that is the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, originated with Ashoka in the 3rd century before the Common Era, whereas the original formula was singular. That is to say, the original Buddhists only took their refuge, or more properly retreat, in the Dharma alone. There's also the custom, as in Islam, in the early days, not to represent the Buddha, either by verbal description or visually, which is another interesting point. The centerpiece was really the Dharma, not the Buddha. Principle number 35, the minor rules of the Vinaya. Contrary to the fundamentalism that appears to affect many followers of the Vinaya today, The Buddha further declared that the lesser and minor, quote-unquote, the lesser and minor rules of the Vinaya might be abolished. Unfortunately, when the Buddha said this, it did not occur to Ananda to ask the Buddha which of the rules were major and which were minor. So the first Buddhist council, led by Mahakassapa, the so-called father of the Sangha, took the conservative approach of abolishing none of them. There are 6 Vinayas known today, that of the Theravada, Mahasangika, Mahasasaka, Dharmaguptaka, Sarvatavada, and Mulasarvastivada, 3 of which are still followed by the Theravada, East Asian Buddhists, and Tibetan Buddhists. But the scholarly consensus is that the Mahasangika Vinaya is the oldest. The Mahasangika subsequently developed into the Mahayana. Although many religious Buddhists strongly emphasize the rules of the Vinaya, the original Buddhist Sangha did not follow any fixed set of rules. These developed gradually over the course of the Buddha's life in response to specific situations. Apparently, the Buddha was quite flexible about the observance of the rules. For example, according to the Vinaya itself, the rules may be abrogated if required to do so for reasons of health or to prevent a crime. Alcohol and drugs were permitted for the purpose of healing. The Buddha frequently warns the monastics against attachment to rules, rituals, and beliefs. A Vajrayan monk complained to the Buddha that he could not stand such training with so many rules and regulations. Far from reprimanding him, the Buddha then asked him whether he could stand the threefold training in higher morality, higher thought, and higher insight. In Mahayana, these became the 3 higher trainings. Once proficient in this, lust, malice, and delusion would be abandoned, and no wrong deed would be performed without needing to follow the rules as such. The implication, then, is that slavish adherence to the letter of the rules is not required to attain emancipation. Interestingly, the Vajrayans also brought about the great schism in the Buddhist order during the Second Buddhist Council on this very question of rules. The core of the Vinaya is given in the Patimokkha. When one analyzes these rules, one finds just about 10 essential rules, very similar in fact to the Bodhisattva precepts. You can find them in various places, including online at a URL which I will give to you. Grouped into rules that entail automatic expulsion from the Sangha for life, the so-called Parajika. Rules requiring an initial and subsequent meeting of the Sangha, the Sangha Disesa, that result in a period of probation. Indefinite rules, the Aniyata, based on acknowledgement of the offense. Rules entailing confession with forfeiture, the Nisagiyas. Rules entailing confession, the Pachitiya. Violations that must be verbally acknowledged, the Pati Desaniya. And training rules, the Sekiyawata. The Brahmanet Sutra, which was written in the mid-5th century, is one of the oldest summaries of the Bodhisattva precepts, which exist in many variations. And the 10 major Bodhisattva precepts are, and I'm going to read them, but I'm also going to put them in the chat. Not to kill or encourage others to kill, not to steal or encourage others to steal, not to engage in licentious acts or encourage others to do so, not to use false words in speech or encourage others to do so, not to trade or sell alcoholic beverages or encourage others to do so, not to broadcast the misdeeds or faults of the Buddhist community nor encourage others to do so, not to praise oneself and speak ill of others or encourage others to do so, not to be stingy or encourage others to be so, not to harbor anger or encourage others to be angry, and finally, 10th, not to speak ill of the Buddha, the Dharma, or the Sangha, literally the triple jewel, or encourage others to do so. And interestingly, in the Bodhisattva rules, there is also a rule, it must be one of the minor rules, that what is not, as a bodhisattva may not disparage the Hinayana or discourage others from studying or practicing the Hinayana, which is very interesting because Mahayana is generally perceived as being in conflict with the Hinayana, but in fact this rule implies my view, which is that Mahayana includes Hinayana. And in fact, in many Mahayana countries, especially Tibet, for example, study the Hinayana intensively, much as we are doing today with respect to the intensive analysis of the meaning of the Pali Canon. So it is by no means true that Mahayana rejects either Hinayana or the Pali Canon. The reverse may not be the case, however. In addition, there are 48 minor rules which are not always regarded as mandatory. Note that the consumption of alcohol is not expressly forbidden, only trade. Mrs. Rhys-Davids argues in the introduction to her translation of the Kudaka Pata that it is not the sensible use, quote unquote, those are her words, the sensible use of liquors, but rather the habit, frequency, and occasions for indulging in them that was originally prohibited. In any case, it is clear that the Vinaya regards it as a relatively minor offense, being number 51 of the 92 Pachatiyas, requiring confession only, preceded by not to witness military activities, and followed by not to tickle. So it's only one step above not tickling, in terms of its importance as a rule. We know, of course, from the first sutta of the Digha Nikaya, the supreme net, the Brahmajala Sutta, that the Buddha regarded ethical and moral rules to be ora matakang sila matakang, merely profane, mundane, merely ethical practices, quote unquote, a statement that may surprise some religieux. And I just want to find my slide, my UFO slide again. There we go. So the next principle is principle number 36. We're almost there. Earthbound Devas. In a previous section of the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, we learned that at least some lower devas, the spiritual or celestial beings of light, who occupy the higher planes of the 31 planes of existence, coexist with human beings and influence them telepathically. The Buddha himself claimed to be aware of such devas and to have received teachings or dharma from them. We know from our talk on the 31 planes of existence that at least 3 deva realms have intercourse with human beings, including the 4 great kings, the 33 gods, and the Brahma realms, and that the asuras, the anti-gods, sometimes translated titans, seem to occupy the same plane as humans, namely the one-world ocean. Here we encounter another interesting bit of lore with regard to the devas, for Ananda asks Anuruddha, a cousin of the Buddha and one of the 5 principal disciples, which devas he is aware of. Anuruddha was ranked as one of the foremost in the attainment of the divine eye, the Dibha Chaku. Anuruddha refers to sky devas whose minds are earthbound and earth devas whose minds are earthbound, in contrast to devas who are free from craving. The last category implies that devas are capable of practicing dharma and of attainment, something that is implied throughout the Pali Canon despite the dogma that one often hears expressed that only human beings are capable of emancipation. And I was asked about that earlier, in fact. I alluded to this question in a previous talk. The asuras, of course, are another example of earthbound devas, having been cast down from the realm of the 33 gods due to their association with samsara and the powers of nature. The earth devas refers to the 4 great kings, the realm of what we refer to when we refer to the sprites, tree spirits, elves, fairies, pixies, gnomes, Japanese yokai, the Spanish and Latin American duende, various Slavic fairies, and other similar beings of all times and climes. And we've also discussed this in connection with Principle 28. Principle 37. Subhadda was the last monastic to be ordained by the Buddha. Maurice Walsh states in a note that this Subhadda is not the same as that one, perhaps because this Subhadda, a barber, is stated to have ordained late in life, whereas the other Subhadda was a samana, a wandering ascetic of another sect. It is certainly a coincidence that two monastics with the same name were associated with the Buddha's death and the period immediately afterward, but not impossible. On the other hand, some translations of the Mahaparinibbana Sutta refer to Subhadda, the barber, as the late received one, referring perhaps to his being the last disciple to be personally ordained by the Buddha rather than to his age. The Pali Canon denigrates this Subhadda, and this may be the reason why he is distinguished from the Samana Subhadda, but this may also reflect a sectarian prejudice. We know that the first Buddhist council was contentious, and that this contentiousness persisted in later councils too. In any case, Subhadda the barber's suggestion that the rules might be relaxed is what precipitated the first Buddhist council. The first Buddhist council was called together shortly after the Buddha's death by Mahakassapa, who was regarded as foremost in asceticism, despite the fact that the Buddha said that the Sangha should have no leader other than the Dharma. Presumably, Mahakassapa also brought an ascetic orientation to the council, and as with all organizations, he had both supporters and detractors. Indeed, it is clear from the Chulawagga that the council was sponsored by Mahakassapa's group, and that others were excluded. And some people might be surprised by that, but I have a specific textual reference that you can check, which proves that specific observation. The first Buddhist council was held during the rainy season 3 months after the Buddha's death. Since the rainy season retreat begins in late June or July, it seems likely that the Buddha died in March, which is consistent with the statement that the sal trees between which the Buddha died bloomed prematurely. I have already talked about how the Arhants at this council castigated Ananda for convincing the Buddha to ordain women and for failing to clarify which were the major and which were the minor rules of the Vinaya. Indeed, so deep was the misogyny of the Arhants of this council that Ananda was castigated for allowing women to view the Buddha's body after his death, which, they claimed, was defiled by their tears. And I'll give you a reference for that as well, since that might also surprise some people. Presumably, Ananda too had his supporters and detractors, so we see here how the politics of the first Buddhist council may have played out. It is an open question whether all of the monastics present at the first council were men. Dr. Chatsumaran Kabul Singh, in her article, The History of the Bhikkhuni Sangha, argues that female monastics were also present. And I'll actually give you a copy of that article as well. All of these links will, of course, be in the talk as it appears on my blog. So if you're interested in learning more about the first Buddhist council in the primary sources, if you don't want to take my word for it and you want to read the actual historical accounts, according to the Theravada themselves, you can read the 11th chapter of the Chulawagga in the Vinaya section of the Pali Canon. It's online, and I'll give you a link for that as well. So that concludes my talk for today. Thank you very much for your attention. We can now have a question-discussion session if you're interested. I think I saw a few questions pass by while I was speaking. Let me just see if I can find them. Otherwise, if you have a question, just put it in the chat. And if there are no more questions, we'll proceed to the Dharma transmission, or to the dedication of merit, rather, whereby we dedicate the merit of this talk to all beings. I thought I saw a question, but Dar says, actually, there are many Thai bikinis. That's a surprise to me. Believe you're thinking of Sri Lanka. The tradition, the bhikkhuni tradition, was reestablished in Sri Lanka. In Thailand, there is one woman that I know of who has been ordained as a bhikkhuni. She's broken the law doing that. There is a law in Thailand against a woman claiming to be a monastic. It's called impersonating a monastic. The government has stated that it will neither recognize nor prosecute her for that act. But it is illegal in Thailand. For the bhikkhunis are illegal in Thailand. And when Ajahn Brahm, I believe it was, tried to present a talk on bhikkhuni ordination to a conference of Buddhists in Southeast Asia, he was blocked from doing so by the Thai contingent. And that talk is available online now as a result. And many Thai bhikkhus who treat the bhikkhunis as their servants, yes, indeed, that is the way it was set up. Probably after the Buddha's death, the bhikkhuni, the rules of the bhikkhunis, there are 337 rules of the bhikkhunis compared to 227 rules for the male monastics. And a bhikkhuni, no matter what her seniority, must always submit to the authority of a bhikkhu, no matter what his seniority, even if her seniority is greater than his. And also there are rules pertaining to ordination and discipline, where the bhikkhunis have to submit not only to the bhikkhuni sangha but also to the bhikkhu sangha continuously in order to maintain their subservience. In my view, this does not go back to the Buddha. This was something that was done subsequent to the Buddha's death in the early Buddhist councils. Dar says, to address the Theravada and women in the monastics, I believe it is because it was deemed inappropriate when monks interact with women, not because women were viewed second-class citizens, but because monks were practicing purity of mind, and women can be a source of temptation and can hinder the practice. Other theories may only be speculations, but I could be wrong. No, I believe that is the rationale for it. Much like the rationale for covering women in burqas in Muslim Middle Eastern countries is to not to excite the lust of the men. So you're absolutely correct. I believe that is the rationale for that practice. The question is it dharmic? Rollo says, Principle 29 presents a superiority in existing dharma to judge future teachings are valid or correct. Yes, and if you see that as a continuum, of course, once you have an initial dharma that is correct, as long as you're constantly referring subsequent dharma to that original dharma, you can maintain a continuity of correctness. That's the theory or principle underlying it. There is also a principle stated that one can judge for oneself whether a new teaching is valid based on if it is good. Is there a clear distinguished method to settle any debate this divergence may cause? I think that last bit is a question. Is there any clear distinguished method to settle any debate this divergence may cause? Perhaps there is within certain sanghas. I'm not familiar with the minutiae of monastic procedures, so you'd have to ask someone steeped in monastic traditions. And of course, isn't just the one. There's the 6 traditions, the 6 Vinayas. So I don't know the answer to that question, whether there's a procedure or not. Clearly, there should be, and it should be based on consensus, and then if it cannot be resolved by consensus, it should be based on majority rule. That's what the Sutta state. Beyond that, I don't know what procedures might exist for that. Aglow Phoenix says, I came in late. Can you please show your blog link again? I can do that. Just give me one moment. There's my blog link again. Okay, there. I think I've gone through all the questions now. Before we proceed to the dedication of merit, are there any more questions concerning the Mahaparinibbana Sutta or anything relevant thereto? While you're thinking about that, I'll just pull up the dedication of merit. It doesn't seem that anyone has any more questions. After this talk is completed, I'm going to go to the circle in Zhuangzhung at Visit Atoll Sim, and if you're interested in having an informal chat about this sutta, please join me there. But right now, since there are no more questions, let's proceed with the dedication of merit, whereby we dedicate the merit of this talk to all beings. Whatever understanding, whatever positive force has come from this, may it go deeper and deeper and act as a cause to reach enlightenment for the benefit of all. Thank you very much for, once again, your attention during this 2-hour session. It's my pleasure and privilege to discuss Dharma, and we'll be proceeding on with the 17th Sutta next Sunday at 2 p.m. Second Lifetime. I will put the title of the Sutta that we'll be discussing next week in the my group's notices. So if you have joined Dharma Transmission to the West and would like to follow my activities in Second Life, please consider this an invitation to join. And I will now going to Circle in Zhuangzhung at the Visit Atoll Sim for anyone that would like to carry on this discussion.